This webinar was recorded on July 14th, 2020, and all guidance was provided based on the version of SCR Form 310 that was in effect at the time. The information provided on this webinar was meant as general information. If you have any specific questions or questions on updated versions of SCR Form 310, call the SCR Legal Hotline at 803-772-5206. Allison Smallwood, your SCR Director of Legal and Regulatory Affairs here. Today we're going to go over one of the areas of the contract we get the most questions on the hotline, and that's repairs. So this is the part of the contract where you as a buyer or seller are going to have three options that you're going to have to explain to your client, or three different options you can do in the contract. So hopefully in this video, I'm going to kind of do an overview of what's included in these sections, what's not included in these sections, and then some pros and cons of both. And maybe dispel some common myths that are associated with the repair section. So with no further ado, let's get into the form. So repairs are found in paragraph 8 of the contract. This is one of the biggest areas of change to the form that was made in January 2020. There are now going to be 3 repair options built into the contract. Prior to this change, they were in 3 separate forms. So repair procedure was in the contract, due diligence was a separate addendum, and as is was located at the bottom of Form 391. So you will now have 3 options in the contract. You should only choose one of the boxes. If you choose nothing at all, you will default to as is. We'll get into a little later why that's not necessarily a good thing. And if you check multiple boxes, you have a buyer seller who says, hey, I like some of that repair procedure language and I like some of that due diligence language, and they decide that they want to check both boxes. Do know that they will be under repair procedure, because whichever box you check first is the one that you are stuck with. So we'll kind of get into the actual verbiage of each one of these. What are the pros? What are the cons? What is included? What's not included? Kind of dispel some of the myths. So the first thing to notice in repair procedures, you've really got 2 paragraphs. So you've got this first paragraph here, which I would almost call the buyer's paragraph. This is where all the buyer's deadlines are. And the second paragraph here, which is the seller's paragraph, seller deadlines. So buyer is going to do do all their inspections and have their request completed and delivered to the seller by a hard date, by 6 p.m. on a hard date. They need to make sure that they meet that date. If they are late, they have potentially waived their rights to all inspections. So make sure that they are not only doing their inspections by that date, but they've actually delivered those requests to the seller. So in repair procedure, there are things called seller paid repairs. These are going to be your 6 systems being operable, your roof-free leaks, to address environmental concerns, and to make improvements structurally sound. These are sort of the items that you can you reasonably expect that the seller will fix or you'll have recourse for. Anything outside of these 9 items, you're going to have to negotiate for, or just assume that the seller is not going to fix. So what are the 6 systems? We have heating, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, water supply, and wastewater. Those need to be in operative condition. In its most basic definition, that just means that they are going to work. I always kind of say, once you flip the switch and it works, if there's any discussion at that point, then it's going to be a negotiation between the parties. This is important to note here, that the roof is free of leaks. That does not mean that the roof is brand new. That does not mean that the roof is past its useful life. It does not matter the age of the roof. It matters that the roof is free of leaks. That is an important distinction. Just because an inspector says, hey, you may need a new roof, does not mean that that is an obligation of the seller. The seller's response is to give you a roof that is free of leaks. And the environmental concerns and improvements structurally sound are both intentionally broad, because if we listed everything those could possibly be, the contract would be about 80 pages long. The obvious ones under those, environmental, would be radon, black mold, improvement structurally sound, foundation issues, rotting floor joists, things of that sort. So this next paragraph here, next sentence here is really important. So this really comes up under the roof. So you'll have a lender who will come back to you and say, hey, that roof is past its useful life. You need to have a new roof, or we're not going to fund the loan. So at that point, you're really left with 4 options. 1, the seller can buy the roof for you that they never bought for themselves. 2, the buyer can pay for the new roof themselves completely. The third option, the parties can work it out, try to come up with some compromise on that payment. Or 4th, no one fixes the roof is not repaired, and then the loan falls through under financing. But it's important to note that in none of these 3 options below is the seller obligated to get you a new roof. Anytime if you want a new roof, you're going to have to negotiate with the seller to get a new roof. It does not matter whether it's you that's asking for it, an inspector that's recommending it, or a lender that's asking for it. There is no way that you can compel a seller to buy you the roof they did not buy for themselves. And then listed in this first paragraph are some additional repairs that the buyer can choose to do at their expense. This last sentence here is important because this last sentence only appears in repair procedure. And this is something that was added for the changes in 2020. So upon a seller request, the buyer will provide a copy of the inspection report. So this was really meant to try to help us for mediation, resolving conflicts. If there's, say, an issue with the HVAC system, you could have a seller who says, hey, send us the relevant portions of the repair or the repair and the inspection report over the HVAC system so we kind of know what you're talking about. If the buyer responds with, hey, I paid good money for that report, you have no rights to it, then the seller can say, hey, per this last sentence in the first paragraph of section 8, I'm going to ask for it. Do not make a common practice of doing this as a seller, because once your seller receives this information, they're going to be obligated to know everything in that inspection report, and it may change some disclosure answers, because your residential property disclosure is a living, breathing document that you have an obligation as a seller to update through closing with any information that you now realize was inaccurate or misleading. So now we're going to get on to the seller's obligations in this paragraph. So the buyer has delivered all their inspection requests to the seller. The seller, by no later than 6 p.m. on a hard date, will tell you, hey, am I going to make all systems operable, roof-free leaks, and address environmental and structural concerns? If they do that, then the seller has met their obligation as seller-paid repairs. Anything outside of that are not considered seller-paid repairs, and the seller does not have to do those if they do not choose to do so or negotiate for them. Obviously, the seller can still choose to do any of these items that I'm going to talk about in a second, but there's no obligation for the seller to do so. If the seller refuses to do those, the buyer would not be able to walk away without a potential recourse against them. So this bold section here is what we added in 2020. This was always the case, but we kind of wanted to spell out in more detail what exactly are not included in seller-paid repairs. So if you're meeting with your buyer and they say, hey, I really can't stand the flooring in this house, I really want to make sure it's more energy efficient, there's some cosmetic issue I'm really worrying about, and these are deal breakers for me, then make sure that they take note of this here, that, hey, don't assume any of these are going to get fixed. We either need to separately negotiate for these in an addendum, or better yet, if they're really a deal breaker for you, let's do due diligence. Repair procedure is not going to be the options for you. Repair procedure is really to make sure that the systems are operable. If systems are operable and that roof is free of leaks, and basically the way I say it is that you're going to get a house that works day one. So if the seller agrees to make all those seller-paid repairs, then we move on to closing. We are done with repairs. If the seller does not timely respond, so they miss this deadline up here, or they refuse to make all the seller-paid repairs. So say you ask for a leak in the roof to be fixed, and you ask for a new paint in a bathroom, and they say, well, I'll paint the bathroom, but I'm not fixing the leaky roof. Then we will go down here, where within 2 calendar days of this date here, the buyer will be able to accept the property in its present condition, negotiate for payments of these repairs, or terminate by delivery notice. This does nothing with regards to earnest money. Earnest money still has to be dispersed through a mutual agreement of the parties, a signed release, or a court order. So just because the seller refuses to make repairs does not mean the buyer is automatically entitled to the earnest money back. Make sure as a buyer's agent, you are never telling your client that they will automatically get their earnest money back, because you cannot guarantee that. Mutual agreement of the parties, court order, that's the only way earnest money can be dispersed in South Carolina. Give them the earnest money disclosure form when you first meet with them, Form 620. That's a great form to kind of advise them. So if the buyer fails to do anything within this 2 calendar day window, then they are going to have an as-is contract in regards to repairs. And of course, the obligations of the seller for repairs to terminate upon closing. So that's sort of a run through of what's exactly in the repair procedure. We'll now get into due diligence, and then at the end, I'll kind of walk through the pros and cons of each. So due diligence, we didn't really change a whole lot from here. So this is almost exactly the same language that you had in your due diligence addendum, with the one exception being we now have it expire at 6 p.m. on a hard date as opposed to a number of business days. The rationale from the committee of changing things to hard dates were it's much easier for everyone to understand. It takes all the gray out of it. Everyone understands what 6 p.m. on July 15th means. It doesn't require any sort of calculation on business days. So within this due diligence period, the buyer can conduct any and all inspections that they would like. They need to then deliver a request to the seller of those, and then they need to, by 6 p.m. on whatever date it is, the parties need to either have agreed to repairs, agreed to extend the due diligence period, the buyer needs to have terminated the contract by delivering notice of termination and a termination fee, or at 6:01, we have an as-is contract in regards to repairs. This is not the deadline for the buyer to get repairs requests to the seller. This is the all-in deadline. Everything needs to be done by this time. So make sure that you're planning accordingly as you're negotiating a contract back and forth, that you're changing that date if you need to reflect how long it's been that you are negotiating. So understanding the best way to kind of structure this is, say you have a 10-day due diligence period, you'd maybe want to give your buyer 5 days to do the inspections, then say, hey, we're going to send our request to the seller, send it all in one document, because once you send a repair request and the seller signs it, that ends your due diligence period regardless of how many days are left. So if I send you a repair request and we're under due diligence, a period that expires August 1st, and I sign this, and I send you, hey, I want the bathroom painted, and you go as the seller, go ahead and sign that repair request, we have now ended our due diligence period, even though I had negotiated prior to have August 1st. So make sure that you're sending everything at one time, but then when you send it, you're giving the seller enough time to get estimates, get contractors in there to look at it. You're not sort of boxing the seller in. So like I said, I would send it to if we have a 10-day due diligence period, 5 days for me to do my inspections, maybe give the seller 3 days to do theirs, and then we're going to say, hey, by day 8, end of day 8, this repair request is going to expire. That's going to give my buyer 2 days to kind of react to whatever the seller does. If the seller agrees to all of our returns, great. We don't need the extra 2 days because we got everything we wanted. If the seller counters back with, hey, you asked for 8 things, but I only want to do 4, then we go back to this buyer and say, hey, are these 4 okay? Do we want to try to get a 5th one? What do we want to do? Or was it, hey, if you don't give us all 8, we're going to walk away. And then we need to make sure we have enough time to coordinate getting that notice of termination and that termination fee to the seller within that due diligence period. Do note the termination fee is a completely separate pot of money from earnest money. That should not be taken from earnest money, cut from earnest money. That is a completely separate pot of money that is from the buyer to the seller. The termination fee would be negotiated here. SCR does not have any sort of recommended amount. That's going to really depend based on the length of time that you're going to be under due diligence, the price of the property, how hot the property is. Maybe if you're in a multiple offer situation, the amount of termination fee can be used as a distinguishing characteristic. So that's really something that's going to be negotiated between the parties. If under the due diligence period, you essentially don't come to any terms, again, you're going to be in as-is regards to repairs. So now we'll move on to as-is. So this is the option you are stuck with if you refuse to check any of the 3 boxes. I always kind of say, for 99% of the time, imagine that there is an imaginary cash buyer parentheses next to as-is, because if you do as-is and then you're also got a lender involved, you're sort of asking for issues. So as-is is really what it means. The buyer's going to buy the property for the price agreed upon, and the seller is going to maintain the property as it is, subject to normal wear and tear. We do allow the buyer the right to inspect the property by 6 p.m. on a certain date for informational purposes only. So as is really intended for, hey, we're going to do a refurbishing of the house. We're going to flip the house. We're going to demo the house. And you want to maybe go look at the property and say, hey, before we line up our contractors after closing, let's make sure how we need to structure this. So let's make sure the floor is structurally sound before we maybe hire someone to come in and do cabinets or granite countertops or something to that effect. But it's important to note there's nothing that the buyer can find during these inspections that will obligate the seller to fix it or allow the buyer to terminate. So your buyer needs to be completely aware when they do as is that regardless of what they find in the property, they cannot exit the contract without potentially facing legal recourse against them by the seller. So now I'm going to kind of go through some of the pros and cons of each and kind of dispel the myth that you often will hear, well, hey, one of these is really the buyer option, one of these is really the seller option, and when would be a good time to use each of these? Again, this is really going to be a fact-specific, transaction by transaction decision between you and your client based on what their exact needs and desires are. So under repair procedure, really, like I said, this is for the person who just wants a house that works. They're not so worried about cosmetic issues. They don't mind doing some painting, doing some changing of some bathroom fixtures, etc. So that's the pros on this are, as a buyer, the seller has to make the systems operable, roof-free leaks. If they don't, I'm going to have the ability to walk out of the contract, and I'm not going to have to pay a termination fee for doing it. The advantage of a repair procedure from a seller standpoint is it shrinks down the possible universe of repairs that I can be responsible for. And I really know, hey, I just need to make sure I'm getting these systems operable, roof-free leaks, and address environmental structural concerns. I'm not going to have to worry about carpeting, tile, things of that sort. I'm really going to be laser focused on these nine items. A couple, example would be, if we have an HVAC that is completely not working, not operable whatsoever, and the seller refuses to fix it, the buyer would be able to walk away without having to pay a termination fee, without any recourse. There would still not be an obligation of the seller to fix it, because our contract cannot compel the seller to make any repairs, but the buyer would be able to walk away without having to pay anything. The other disadvantage I would say for a repair procedure is you've got a number of dates you have to keep in mind, and it may drag on a little bit longer than maybe your due diligence period would. So the advantage on due diligence is the buyer can ask for, from buyer side, you can ask for whatever you would like. You can do any and all inspections that you wish, and you can terminate the contract at any, during the due diligence period at any point for any reason. The downside from the buyer side is if you do that, you may have to pay a termination fee for doing so. On the seller side, the advantage of due diligence is your default is I'm not fixing anything. Anything that we're going to fix has to be negotiated with me with the buyer. The downside from the seller, of course, is that at any point the buyer can wake up and decide they no longer want my house and can terminate. Of course, that's why the termination fee would be important to try to balance that out. It's sort of the counterweight for the buyer gets the right to terminate the contract during the due diligence period at any time for any reason. The counterweight to that is the seller would require a termination fee that has to be paid at that moment. If the seller refuses to pay the termination fee, then they have not validly terminated the contract under due diligence and would be stuck with an as is. So the pros and cons of as is are really that it does not obligate the parties to anything. So what you see is what you get. However, I do recommend instead of as is that you really try to do due diligence if possible. The reasoning is the obligations of the seller are the exact same between due diligence and as is. Neither obligates the seller to fix a single thing that they do not want to fix, but under due diligence, we allow the buyer to do any all inspections and they may be able to walk away. Because if there's a buyer who really is not happy with the property, they're going to try to walk away from the deal anyway. At least with the due diligence, you kind of find it out sooner. You get rid of it. Maybe you get a termination fee out of it. But just because a property is listed in the MLS as is doesn't mean that they can only accept contracts with as is on it. They would still need to present any and all offers because maybe you put enough money in a termination fee, you don't ask for that long of a due diligence period, and maybe it's not such a heavy lift for the seller. Yeah, so the biggest takeaways from this are understanding the different options, understanding that each contract, each transaction is a little different, and so there's not a one-size-fits all for these. Talk to your brokerage, figure out what your brokerage policies are, what your brokerage preferences are, but understanding that really you're going to want to try to make the repairs match the individual transaction, and really making sure that all parties understand that none of these options have a preferential treatment in regards to earnest money. Earnest money is still going to require that mutual agreement of the parties or a court order. There's not one of these options that's going to give you sort of an easier road to getting earnest money back. There's not really a difference on that end. So that's it. That's it for me today. If you have any questions on this or any other forms, give us a call on the hotline, 803-772-5206, or give myself or our general counsel, Byron King, an email. It's just our first names, Austin or Byron at screaltors.org.